January 30, 1944. Anzio beachhead, Italy. The pencil shook in Hetman Vera Hoffman's grasp as he pressed it to the concrete wall of his command shelter, recording the events he had just observed through the periscope. The Americans have artillery of beyond imagining destructive capability. Bunker Louisa has been erased. 4 feet of reinforced concrete were obliterated instantly. Amidst the haze and debris, Hoffman observed the cavity where the fortification had stood for 8 months. The bunker, which was rated to endure direct impacts from 210 mm shells per Wehrmacht engineering criteria, was wiped out by a single shot from an American super heavy gun located beyond eyesight. 32 members of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division disappeared, along with tons of steel and concrete. The weapon in question was the M1240 mm howitzer, used in battle for the first time by the 697th Field Artillery Battalion. What both Hoffman and thousands of German troops would come to realize over the coming months was that every existing idea about fortification warfare had suddenly become outdated. The U.S. Army had fielded a weapon capable of converting the most robust bunker into a grave with mathematical accuracy. The M1240 mm howitzer resulted from a 1940 U.S. Army Ordnance study reaching a stark judgment. At that time, American artillery could not break through modern European fortifications. America's largest gun at the time, the 155 mm long Tom, could inflict damage but could not reliably eradicate reinforced concrete bunkers that were quickly becoming the norm in German defensive strategy. The requirements requested appeared unattainable. The specification was a mobile weapon that fired a 360-pound shell over 14 miles with accuracy sufficient to strike individual bunkers, while being able to pierce 6 feet of reinforced concrete. The full system was required to be capable of transport by ordinary military trucks. Differing from the huge rail-mounted guns of World War I, the system developed at Watervliet Arsenal in New York turned out to be a triumph of engineering. At 64,700 pounds in firing configuration, the M1 needed a 14-man crew, and it was able to launch 1 shot every 3 minutes at peak output. The barrel's weight alone was 23,000 pounds and it measured 35 feet, calling for specialized carriage on a 6-wheel trailer. Average deployment time was 8 hours, including digging a recoil pit and setting up using the M2 crane, which was always paired with the weapon. Manufacturing began in November 1942 with just 6 prototypes. By 1944, Watervliet Arsenal had reached a production pace of 13 howitzers per month and ultimately produced precisely 315 pieces before halting production in August 1945. The unit cost for each gun was $380,000, the same cost as 12 Sherman tanks, although their operational worth proved to be beyond estimation. The 697th and 698th Field Artillery Battalions arrived at the Anzio beachhead in January 1944, bringing with them the earliest M1240 mm howitzers for use in warfare. The German 14th Panzer Corps had fortified the nearby hills with layered bunkers overseeing all routes leading to Allied forces. At 14:30 on January 30, 1944, the 697th unleashed the first combat 240 mm shell, aiming for a German observation post on the Auburn Hills. The shot covered 23,000 yards, over 13 miles, directly striking its target. The bunker, along with its observers and equipment, was obliterated. Major Herman E. Smith, who led the 697th, documented the weapon's psychological effects in his unit's records. After their opening day's barrage, German captives reported that their units had become utterly demoralized. They referenced the earthquake shells that caused tremors over hundreds of meters near their impact zones. Many men declined to remain in bunkers after seeing the results of the American bombardment. The destructive calculations at Anzio were noted in detail. Total rounds fired, 2,847. Number of bunkers engaged, 67. Bunkers destroyed, 61. Rounds per bunker on average, 4.8. Maximum recorded range, 25,100 yards. The war log of the German 715th Infantry Division, seized after Rome was captured, observed, American super heavy artillery renders our fortified locations indefensible. Single shells cause more casualties than entire days of standard shelling. The breakthrough at Monte Cassino in May 1944 proved the 240 mm howitzer's effectiveness against impregnable defensive structures. The Gustav Line had withstood repeated Allied attempts for months, anchored by the ancient abbey that had been turned into a fortress by German paratroopers. The 240th Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 8 M1 howitzers, entered Operation Diadem on May 11, 1944. Set up near Mono, they could target any German position along the Gustav Line. Their main assignments were the armored bunkers carved into the slope below the monastery. British Major General Francis Tuka, whose 4th Indian Division had suffered heavy losses in prior attacks, saw the 240 mm bombardments and reported that the American super heavy pieces accomplished what months of air raids and normal cannons could not. Each shell that hit its mark wiped out a German strongpoint entirely. The psychological toll on the defenders was overwhelming. They came to realize there was nowhere secure. The 240 mm batteries opened fire continually for 72 hours during the decisive battle, using up 1,847 shells. Afterward, analysis showed of 43 key enemy bunkers hit, 39 had been wiped out. Of the 4 positions left standing, the occupants had deserted after near impacts. The 240 mm howitzer's devastating power was due to more than its weighty projectiles. It also benefited from the American system of fire coordination. The concept of the fire direction center, refined during 3 years of warfare, delivered unrivaled accuracy and control. Forward observers with 610 Seychelles rupees radios could request fire from well away from the guns. Their target data was conveyed to the FDC, where trained operators with graphical tables, slide rules, and weather data calculated solutions. In just 4 minutes from a fire call, shells could reach targets over 14 miles out. The technique called time on target magnified the psychological blow. Batteries in different places, using staggered timing, landed their shells on the same target simultaneously. A German bunker might be hit by 6 240 mm shells in a 2-second span, delivering more than a ton of explosives with no warning. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas B. Hedkin, who led the 245th Field Artillery Battalion, stated in a report from 1944, "We do not shoot indiscriminately at targets. What we carry out are precise attacks. A forward observer singles out a particular bunker. We calculate the trajectory and place 1 or 2 shells right on top of it. The accuracy unnerves the Germans more than a barrage of random shelling." 4 M1240 mm howitzers assigned to the 19th Corps were involved in Operation Cobra, the pivotal July 1944 offensive from the Normandy beachhead. The German 352nd Infantry Division had reinforced every hedge and intersection around Saint-Lô, constructing a network of defenses that halted the Allied push for several weeks. On July 24, the 272nd Field Artillery Battalion deployed their 240 mm howitzers, methodically eliminating German strongholds that had survived the extensive aerial bombardment. The dominating feature over Saint-Lô, Hill 122, was reinforced with bunkers of concrete placed in the rear slopes, making them impervious to air attacks. Technical Sergeant Raymond Jones, the section chief of Battery A of the 272nd Field Artillery, later recounted, "We observed the Germans believing they were protected in those rear slope spots. Our spotter radioed the coordinates. We delivered 3 shells for effect. After the smoke disappeared, there was only a cavity in the hillside where the bunker was. The psychological effect was instant. The German 3rd Parachute Division, seasoned troops who had served at Cassino, began fleeing their fortified positions rather than confront 240 mm shelling. Their leader, General Richard Schy, was apprehended on July 31 and informed his interrogators, "Your extremely heavy artillery prevented a static defense. My soldiers, experienced men who had never retreated before, abandoned their bunkers. The attack on the Gothic Line in northern Italy during the fall of 1944 showcased the effectiveness of the 240 mm howitzer in mountainous terrain. German military engineers had invested a year in building strongpoints along the Apennine ridges, exploiting the terrain to form placements they believed to be invulnerable to artillery. In September 1944, the 697th Field Artillery Battalion, who had seen action at Anzio and in the advance to Rome, located their howitzers within the valleys beneath the Gothic Line. With high trajectory fire, they were able to land shells nearly straight down onto German positions hewn into the concealed sides of mountains. The destruction of the Fuda Pass defenses demonstrated what these weapons could accomplish. The pass, which guarded the principal road to Bologna, was protected by intricate bunker systems erected by Organization Todt. On September 16, 1944, the 697th kicked off a systematic bombardment of these enemy sites. Private First Class Donald Matthews, who handled ammunition for the 697th, wrote in a letter home, "The shells ascend so high they vanish into the clouds, then plunge directly onto the German bunkers. The entire mountain quakes with the blasts. Once we've hit a bunker, only a crater remains." The Fuda Pass was captured within 5 days. German losses from destroyed bunkers surpassed those suffered in direct battles. The War Journal of the 4th Parachute Division noted, "American super heavy shells pierce overhead shelter once considered reliable. Morale is deteriorating as soldiers refuse to use the fortifications." The deliberate destruction of the Siegfried Line starting in September 1944 marked the 240 mm howitzer's most significant role in the Allied triumph. The West Wall extended 390 miles from the Netherlands down to Switzerland, totaling more than 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, and defensive positions constructed between 1936 and 1940. In September 1944, the 265th Field Artillery Battalion rolled their M1 howitzers to the Siegfried Line near Aachen. The defensive structures they encountered were formidable. Type 10 bunkers boasted walls 3 to 4 feet thick, command bunkers featured 8-foot thick walls, and infantry sites enjoyed overlapping fields of fire. The first substantial challenge emerged at the Scharnhorst Line, an offshoot of the Siegfried Line shielding Aachen. On October 8, 1944, the 265th began firing in preparation for the 1st Infantry Division's attack. Over 6 hours, they launched 238 shells, taking out 19 of 22 designated bunkers. Corporal Robert Williams, a forward observer from the 16th Infantry Regiment, saw the shelling firsthand. Every 240 mm shell strike felt like a mini earthquake. Bunkers we were told would take days to neutralize vanished in minutes. The Germans inside stood no chance. This pattern repeated across the front. In December 1944, the 278th Field Artillery Battalion, supporting 5th Corps, destroyed 73 bunkers in the Schnee-Eifel sector. The 698th Field Artillery Battalion served in the Metz region, eradicating the city's fortress ring in November 1944 and firing more than 3,000 rounds in 2 weeks. The campaign in the Vosges Mountains from October to November 1944 posed particular obstacles. The Germans had entrenched themselves in the thickly wooded ridges, using camouflage to conceal their bunkers under the forest canopy. Hidden from air spotters and shielded from regular artillery by the terrain, the 265th Field Artillery Battalion innovated new methods for forest fighting. Utilizing proximity-fused shells when possible, they produced air bursts above the treetops with destructive force driving downward onto bunkers. When equipped with standard shells, they applied Box and 1 Tactics 4 shells at the corners of a suspected target, then a single round directly into the center. Master Sergeant Harold Anderson, Section Chief in the 265, explained the method used. The dense forest hindered visibility, but accuracy was not essential for the 240 mm. A hit nearby could bring down bunkers due to the shock through the ground. Our crew would fire, then wait for the dust to clear, and afterwards, the infantry would encounter nothing except craters and corpses. Before the liberation of Strasbourg on November 23, 1944, the area's outer defenses were struck by barrages from the 240 mm. The German 553rd Infantry Division withdrew after 12 of their bunkers were destroyed in just 90 minutes of concentrated shelling. Later evaluations by American Army engineers clarified the reason why the 240 mm howitzer was so successful against defensive works. The M17, a concrete penetrating projectile, had a steel cap hardened and attached to 360 pounds of mass, traveling at 2,300 feet per second. This combined to transfer nearly 2.8 million foot-pounds of kinetic energy to an area under 20 inches wide. The resulting impact pressure surpassed 200,000 psi, which no known concrete could withstand. More importantly, its delayed action fuse enabled it to penetrate between 3 and 6 feet before erupting. When it exploded within the concrete, engineers called the destruction sympathetic fracturing. The shock reflecting from the steel reinforcement created intricate pressure waves that destroyed entire fortifications internally. The M114 high-explosive shell carried 49 pounds of TNT blended with aluminum powder, boosting its effectiveness by 40% over regular TNT. When set for surface detonation, it would blast craters 50 feet across and 20 feet deep in typical dirt, 30 feet wide and 12 feet deep in stony terrain. Using 240 mm howitzers required immense logistical support that demonstrated American organizational skill. Every battalion needed between 50 and 100 shells 18 to 36 tons each day. 2,000 gallons of fuel for tractors and generators. Maintenance gear designed specifically for the weapon. Ammunition trucks strengthened for the loads. The chain bringing ammunition extended from Watervliet Arsenal to the front, at times covering 3,000 miles. Each round had to be carefully forged, machined to a 0.01-inch margin, filled precisely with explosives, equipped with exact fuses, then checked and test-fired individually. In March 1945, the U.S. Army had stored over 500,000 240 mm rounds at Army depots across Europe. In the busiest month, 35,000 rounds were used during the Rhine crossings. This displayed industrial power unmatched by Germany, Japan, or the Soviets. The Rhine crossing operations conducted in March 1945 highlighted the highest level of performance from the 240 mm howitzer. Operation Plunder, Montgomery's carefully planned crossing event between March 23 and 24 featured the largest artillery bombardment in the West. The American 12th Corps brought 12,240 mm howitzers to the attack. The intended target was the Wesel defensive zone, where the German 84th Infantry Division had created a network of bunkers along the far bank. At 1700 hours on March 23, the 240 mm guns started the methodical bombardment of predetermined targets. Captain William Morrison, leading Battery B, 278th Field Artillery Battalion, reported, "We had air reconnaissance photos of every enemy bunker. Starting at the northern sector, we swept south, hitting each with 4 to 6 shells. By midnight, 31 bunkers were demolished and 12 more were left damaged." The river crossing met little organized opposition. German survivors described feeling utterly broken after seeing their strongpoints fall apart. Afterward, the 84th Division's casualty numbers reported 2,400 losses from artillery alone, the majority from collapsed bunkers. When Army Group B was surrounded in the Ruhr pocket between April 1 and 18, 1945, 240 mm guns pounded industrial buildings converted to strongholds. German command had reinforced factories, using thick concrete to make defensive fortresses. The 698th Field Artillery Battalion was assigned to help attack the pocket's northern area. On April 9, the Crew Steel Works in Essen, strengthened with extra concrete, came under fire. Shells from the 240 mm guns reduced the main complex to broken ruins. Staff Sergeant James Peterson, an observer with the 313th Infantry Regiment, observed the action. These were no ordinary buildings. They were military fortifications, their walls 3 feet in thickness. The 240mm rounds pierced them with ease. The mental impact on the German troops was overwhelming. After they saw the fate of the cruise models, they surrendered en masse. Army Group B, which originally totaled 430,000 men, gave up after only 18 days. Intelligence assessments link the rapid defeat in part to the deliberate devastation of fortified places by the super-heavy artillery, making many Germans believe continued resistance was pointless. Watervliet Arsenal's manufacture of the 240mm howitzers was the highest example of American industrial mobilization. Opened in 1813, the factory had grown into the nation's top large-caliber gun plant by World War II. The numbers tell the whole story. November 1942 saw the completion of 6 test models. In 1943, 72 more were built, for an average of 6 monthly. By 1944, 158 units were produced, averaging 13 each month. January through August of 1945 added 79 guns, averaging 10 a month. In total, 315 howitzers were constructed. The workforce peaked at 9,100 people, running 3 shifts and operating every day. Women made up 35% of workers, doing precise machining tasks once thought too difficult for female hands. Monthly pay at the arsenal surpassed $3 million, making it the region's #1 employer. Each barrel required 65 tons of specialty steel, went through 847 separate machining steps, endured 72 hours of high-precision boring, high-temperature treatment in 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit furnaces, and was proof-fired under excess pressure one at a time. Quality oversight was extraordinary. Of all the 315 manufactured guns, only 2 did not pass acceptance trials, both with minor recoil problems that were quickly fixed. In no instance did an M1240mm howitzer fail in battle with catastrophic consequences. German military could not grasp the scale of the American ability to manufacture 240mm shells. By 1944, Watervliet Arsenal was manufacturing 2,000 rounds each month. Supplementary output from Picatinny Arsenal and civilian contractors increased the total monthly production to 10,000 rounds by the start of 1945. Every shell was an example of precise mass production, with a shell body formed from 4,140 chrome molybdenum steel, finished to tolerances within plus or minus 0.0101 inches, loaded with 49 pounds of grade A TNT, equipped with meticulously crafted rotating bands, and subjected to individual gauging and inspection. The supply chain delivered this munitions supply with outstanding effectiveness. Liberty ships transported 240mm shells as deck freight, with each vessel capable of carrying up to 500 rounds. Within the Red Ball Express truck columns, there were dedicated ammunition units using reinforced trucks made specifically for the 360-pound shells. By April 1945, United States troops in Europe had fired 118,429 rounds of 240mm ammunition while keeping more than 100,000 rounds in theater stockpiles. This extravagant use, unachievable by any other combatant, amplified the psychological effect of the weapon. Operating the M1240mm howitzer required superior teamwork and significant physical stamina. Each gun crew of 14 men acted as a closely synchronized group, with each role vital for the functioning of the gun. Crew duties comprised a chief of section NCO overseeing the piece, a gunner in charge of aiming the gun, an assistant gunner managing the breech, numbers 3 through 8 as ammunition handlers, numbers 9 and 10 operating the M2 crane, numbers 11 and 12 as powder handlers, and numbers 13 and 14 serving as vehicle drivers and security personnel. Loading the gun called for highly developed coordination. The 360-pound projectile was hoisted by crane, maneuvered into the breech by 4 crew members, and then rammed in with hydraulic equipment. The propellant, consisting of as many as 8 individual bags, was placed behind the shell. For a skilled team, The entire loading sequence was completed in 90 seconds. Private First Class Michael Sullivan, who served as an ammunition handler with the 697th Field Artillery Battalion, recounted the physical strain. After firing 10 rounds, everyone became fatigued. The blast from each shot felt like a blow to the chest. To maintain effectiveness, we changed positions hourly, but knowing the devastation our shells caused to German bunkers drove us onward. The forward observers responsible for adjusting 240 mm fire took on one of the most hazardous assignments of the conflict. Located with front-line infantry and often operating beyond friendly positions, they identified targets and corrected fire with deadly accuracy. Lieutenant Robert Anderson, a forward observer in the 265th Field Artillery Battalion, completed 187 days in combat. In his own account, he directed fire that destroyed 47 German bunkers. In a 1985 conversation, he recalled, calling in a 240 mm strike felt like invoking Thor's hammer. I would spot a bunker, communicate the coordinates, and within minutes it would be gone. The power was both thrilling and sobering. Each shell potentially ended the lives of dozens of enemy troops. The observer's gear featured a BC scope with 20x magnification, an M1 plotting board, and 610 Seychelles rupees radio, a 48-pound portable radio, a map case with aerial images, a compass, and a rangefinder. The mental burden was intense. Through their optics, forward observers witnessed the direct aftermath of their missions: German soldiers escaping from shelters, the injured, and those killed. Numerous observers reported experiencing bad dreams long after the war had concluded. Intercepted German records and interviews after the conflict showed how frightening the 240 mm attacks were. The Wehrmacht, hardened from battling the Soviets who favored overwhelming artillery barrages, was nevertheless unprepared for the precision of U.S. fire support. A German 7th Army report from November 1944 captured at Metz declared, "Enemy super-heavy artillery is a new style of conflict. Specific bunkers are hit with very precise fire. Losses from individual projectiles exceed those from traditional shelling. The effect on morale is disastrous. Soldiers refuse to man forward bunkers." The German 19th Army in the Vosges attributed 60% of their casualties to artillery, with the 240 mm shells resulting in disproportionately high losses, despite their restricted supply. Bunkers that protected soldiers for months turned into traps of death after being targeted by American spotters. Reminiscences from German veterans after hostilities repeatedly underscored the traumatic effect. Former Oberst Heinrich Simon, a regimental commander on the Siegfried Line, remarked in 1962, "We could survive regular artillery, but those colossal shells broke our will. When a bunker vanished, you realized nowhere offered safety. A number of my soldiers shot themselves rather than wait for another shell to strike." The M1240 mm howitzer constituted part of a combined Allied super-heavy artillery arsenal which included British and Soviet heavy guns, but American manufacturing capability set them apart. Production statistics were as follows. The US M1240M howitzer saw 315 units produced. The British BL 7.2-inch howitzer reached 36 units. The Soviet 280M BR-5 mortar totaled 47 units. Germany produced 8 24cm K3 railway guns. America's superiority lay not only in quantity but also in being able to move and operate their guns continuously. German and Soviet super-heavy artillery needed railways or major site setup, whereas the M1 could be hauled at low speed by crawler vehicles to any location with the right terrain. Reports from British personnel repeatedly commended American super-heavy pieces. Major General Sidney Kirkman, artillery leader of the 13th Corps, commented, "The American 240 mm howitzer performed tasks our own large-caliber guns could not accomplish: the systematic, rapid demolition of strong defensive structures." At Cassino, these artillery units were primarily responsible for the Allied breakthrough. As Allied armies advanced into German territory in early 1945, The 240mm howitzer persisted in inflicting damage. All German urban centers that Hitler designated as fortresses faced deliberate bombardment from super-heavy guns. The siege at Aschaffenburg from March 25 to April 3, 1945, showed the weapon's ability in urban combat. Continues.